Hey guys, so this is the first video of the semester. We're actually going to be talking about the origins of the U.S. Constitution. And the first thing I'm going to get into here is there's a common misconception in the United States that we're a direct democracy. Now, we do have quite a few democratic aspects to our government, but in reality, we're not a democracy. We're what's called a constitutional federal republic, where you vote for your leaders and they make the larger decisions for the rest of the country. Now, direct democracies have existed in the past in places like Athens. But the way that those worked was that everyone that was eligible to vote, that wanted to, would meet in something called an ecclesia. And while that worked for them there, that was them voting on every single thing for the country. And there's a lot of reasons that it couldn't work in the United States. The idea of a direct democracy was thrown around at the founding of the country, but the issues that came with it just weren't worth giving it a try. The country was just way too big for information to travel quickly. Everything traveled very, very slowly. Now, contrary to the 1700s, the issue that we'd probably run into now if we were to try this is there's just way too much information. With the internet, social media, I'm sure you're all familiar with fake news at this point, and the craziest part about that is that even with Google fact checking, even AI now, there are people on all parts of the political spectrum that just refuse to believe something if it aligns with their political beliefs. Now, a direct democracy doesn't offer protections for minority groups either. And while the majority always getting what they want may sound like a good thing at face value, eventually it's going to go bad. Everyone, no matter what, has something about themselves that could marginalize them. And not just the color of your skin or where you're from, maybe it's the color of your eyes, your hair, a food allergy, some other genetic disposition. The key point being is that eventually there's a strong potential for it to turn into mob rule or a population out of fear to vote away their rights and to become a dictatorship. Now, this is something that our founding fathers knew. They took this into consideration. And James Madison even said that the people are never without the disposition to deceive themselves, sometimes as strong a disposition to be deceived by others. This is something that I think we can all agree on. The part we may not agree on is who he's talking about. But the truth is, he's really talking about all of us, depending on the subject. Now, Alexander Hamilton was even harsher in his critique of our general population, saying that the voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however generally the maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true. In fact, the people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Essentially, he's saying we can't be trusted to make the correct decisions for the country. So now that that's out of the way, how did we become a republic? Well, it all starts with King George III, and while it may not have been the first, it was the first major action seen as aggression by the crown by the colonists. It was the Stamp Act in 1765. Now, if it was printed, it was taxed. That's documents, newspapers, playing cards, even dice. It wasn't enacted to pay, it was enacted to pay down war debts and to keep soldiers in the Americas after the 7 Years' War had ended. I kind of put England in kind of a rough spot. And it led to the saying that we still hear today every once in a while, and that is no taxation without representation. This is something that this isn't something they just came up with. It came from the Magna Carta. That's a document that was signed in Britain all the way back in 1215, but it lays out the framework for rights to be retained by the citizens of the United Kingdom, many of which would influence the American Constitution, specifically the first 10 amendments that's also known as the Bill of Rights. No taxation without representation comes from the section that reads, kings cannot impose taxes without common council, meaning representation, which the colonies didn't have. While that was the first, it was nowhere near the last. Later on in 1770, the Boston Massacre would take place on King Street in Boston, Massachusetts, when colonists started throwing snowballs at British soldiers. Now, it escalated from there pretty quickly, from snowballs to sticks and stones, and it led to the soldiers opening fire. They killed 5 people and ended up wounding another 6, and it strengthened anti-British sentiments. Now, while there were incidents leading up to this, we're going to jump way ahead 3 years to the Tea Act of 1773. Now, we know about the Boston Tea Party. It's one of those things that gets talked about a lot when we're younger in school, but what led up to it is still commonly misunderstood. Now, the Tea Act was viewed as a tax, but at its core, it was actually a big business bailout that would actually make tea in the Americas cheaper, but it cut out the local merchants. The East Indian Trading Company was hurting financially. Now, while they were a private enterprise, the crown had grown reliant on them for goods from around the world, and in an effort to help them, the East Indian Trading Company was granted a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies without having to first dock in England. Now, this led to the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, an organization who had formed in 1760 in opposition to the Stamp Act, used civil disobedience, threats, sometimes violence, to intimidate loyalists and challenge British authorities. They gathered, they disguised themselves as a tribe, the Mohawk Indians, and they took to the East Indian ships. They started throwing the tea overboard, and in that one night, they ended up throwing 92,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. Now, amongst the Sons of Liberty, there was Paul Revere, who would be pinnacle in the beginning of the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Thomas Gage, the governor of Massachusetts, enacted laws to punish citizens for actions against the crown. Now, groups like the Sons of Liberty had committed plenty of. Now, on April 19th, 1775, British troops would actually make landfall in the early morning hours in Lexington. They'd been sent to confiscate all the arms and ammunitions from the colonists in fear of an armed uprising. But this action would have the opposite effect and set off the war. Paul Revere and others would ride. We know the Paul Revere's Great Ride. They would ride out. They would signal the alarm, riding through the surrounding areas, notifying the militias and the Minutemen of what was going on. And they gathered and they started making their way into Lexington. Now, as British troops came into Lexington, they saw a small group of militiamen, but before they could open fire, the commanding officer ordered them all to scatter. And while shots were fired, it's still unclear who actually shot first there. Now, the shot heard around the world, as it's come to be known, would come later. As British soldiers made their way to secure the Northern Bridge in Concord, Isaac Davis and his men were making their way into town. And they'd seen significant amounts of lights around the city, assuming the British had already started to set fire to the town. And as they're making their way to the same bridge as the British, they'd have this encounter that starts the war. British troops fire on the Minutemen. They kill a man by the name of Davis and another, Isaac Davis, and another of his men. They wounded 4. After that shot, Major John Buttrick yells out, "For God's sake, men, fire." And the Patriot troops fire for the first documented time in the conflict, killing 3 men. They wound another 9. The militia would continue their attack on the British into their retreat. And when the conflict started, the local militia was outnumbered. By the end, their numbers had grown to over 3,500 to the British's 1,500. In all, the British would total 273 casualties, and the militiamen would only suffer 93. Now, from that point forward, there'd be over 30 more engagements, including the Battle of Cedars, where troops went into Canada. But if we talked about all these, that would be the whole semester. So unfortunately, we're going to have to skip over those. That's going to take us all the way to July 4th, 1776, and the Declaration of Independence. Now, even though that's the day we celebrate, most of the signatures weren't actually added until August 2nd, but that doesn't have the same ring to it as July 4th. Now, we don't normally talk about what happened after that, between the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the forms of government that we have now, but we didn't just jump straight to it. Okay, we tried something different, and it failed miserably. It was called the Articles of the Confederation. It set the government up more like the European Union would be, but without each state being its own country. Now, the federal government couldn't tax the states. They couldn't print money, which sounds kind of nice on the taxation part, but who's going to loan money to a new country with no certainties that they're going to be able to ever get that money back? Now, it didn't control interstate commerce. They couldn't raise an army. And at the time this was passed, we were still at war with Great Britain. So there was already a unification in the country. But by the end of the war, things had already started to fall apart and come to a head with something called Shays' Rebellion. Now, Daniel Shays was a former Army captain in the Revolutionary War, and others that had fought returned to their normal lives, only to find that the state of Massachusetts had implemented high taxes on their farms, leading to foreclosures and even debtor's prison for some. Now, you would think that the whole reason they just fought a war would have kept the states from doing the same thing, but here we find ourselves. Now, Shays leads a revolt that turns into an uprising of over 4,000 people. And had it not been for privately funded militias, Massachusetts may not have been part of the United States for very long. Now, the conflict came to its head as 1,200 men attempted to seize the Springfield Armory, but they were outmatched, bringing the conflict to an end. Now, one thing was made abundantly clear by this, and it was that the Articles of the Confederation weren't going to work. So our leaders gather again in order to amend the Articles, but they ended up scrapping the whole thing with the exception of the name. They liked what we had called the country. And by 1787, the Constitution had been drawn up. It consisted of 7 articles, and it wouldn't be completely ratified until 1788. Now, the Bill of Rights was the first 10 amendments. It wouldn't be added until 1791 at the demand of some of the holdout states. Now, the fear on the part of some of our leaders, including James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, was that if we started writing our rights down, that eventually our government could say, hey, if it's not written down, then you don't have it. Now, currently, our Constitution consists of the 7 articles and 27 amendments, with the last being added in 1992. That was actually after being on the books for over 203 years. It was originally part of the 12 amendments that had made it to proposal for the Bill of Rights, but it never got voted on. Now, for what the articles do and the amendments each do, I'm going to post another video underneath this one. I'll add the link in Blackboard, and that should explain the articles and the amendments. It's kind of a long video, so you can split it up a little bit. Thanks for watching this, and I will see you next time.